Why the richest empire in history died poor, the Spanish paradox. On a cold morning in 1557, ink froze in the corners of Madrid's ledgers. Couriers ran through stone corridors with red wax letters. We think Spain stumbled because it fought too many wars. It didn't lose the war. It ran out of cash, and the balance sheet made the verdict. Bankruptcy, insolvency, and a kingdom drowning in its own money. Picture Spain at its peak and you see a planet wrapped in one flag, ports coughing up silver, cathedrals rising like stone thunder, parades of armor, incense, and velvet. The empire looked like a god who could not bleed. Gold flashed on altars while drums echoed through plazas. In Seville, coins clinked like rain on roof tiles. In Madrid, ministers spoke in absolutes as if math could be bullied. The crown wore certainty like a second skin. You could smell it in the streets. Wax from candles, sweat from horses, orange peel and gunpowder. Power had a scent, and Spain was soaked in it. Maps were red with Spanish claims, as if the world had been branded Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, Naples, the Netherlands, even the far islands beyond the edge of common imagination. The king's court moved like a theater with endless budget. Silk sleeves brushed marble. Trumpets cut the air. Every gesture said, "The empire will last forever." But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The rot was not moral first. It was numerical. It was the quiet arithmetic of a ledger that refused to be impressed. The paradox begins with a simple mistake. Spain treated metal like wealth. It treated incoming silver like production. It believed the earth could do the work that people should do. Silver is not bread. Silver is not steel. Silver is not a shipyard hammer hitting rivets. Silver is a scorecard, and Spain mistook the score for the game. At first it felt like destiny, a constant river of bullion crossing the ocean, a miracle you could count in sacks and bars. The empire's balance sheet looked like it had discovered an infinite loophole, so they spent. They spent like men who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. They spent like addicts with a fresh supply and a weak memory for consequences. Wars ate money the way fire eats oxygen. Each campaign was a furnace. Each victory demanded more fuel. Each defeat demanded even more. The crown's accountants became surgeons, stitching numbers back together. They cut and folded. They pledged next year's silver before it arrived. They wrote promises on paper and called it strength. That entered the room like a polite stranger. Then it stayed. Then it moved into the walls. Spain's addiction was not only silver. It was borrowed time, sold at interest. This is where the real antagonist appears. Not an admiral, not a rebel leader. A creditor with clean hands and sharp eyes. The banker who smiles while measuring your throat. In the shadows of Europe's counting houses, lenders watched Spain like fishermen watching a whale. A whale means profit. A whale also means danger, and danger is priced into the interest. The crown wanted everything at once. More ships, more soldiers, more palaces. More holiness stamped into stone. But the ledger doesn't care about holiness. Debt is a living thing when a state feeds it. It grows teeth. It grows hunger. It asks for the same offering every year. Interest paid in real coin. Spain's silver should have made it unkillable. Instead, it made it careless. When money feels easy, discipline feels unnecessary. And that's how empires begin to bleed without noticing. The first cut was inflation, slow and bright as a knife. Too many coins chasing the same bread. Prices rising like a tide in a locked room. The people got paid more for everything. A loaf that once felt ordinary became a small crisis. Cloth became a calculation. Rent became a threat. It wasn't poverty from emptiness. It was poverty inside abundance. Think about the scale of that. The richest empire in Europe had full ships and hungry streets. That is not a war problem. That is a balance sheet problem. Silver poured into Spain, then leaked out like blood through gauze. Foreign merchants took it. Foreign workshops earned it. Spain imported what it should have made. A nation can win battles and still lose the factory floor. When domestic goods become too costly, buyers turn away. The country becomes a buyer, not a builder. Spain became a funnel. Silver came in loud. Silver went out quiet. It traveled into the hands of rivals who used it to hire better crews, forge better cannon, and finance better trade. Meanwhile, Spanish industry suffocated. Workshops closed. Craftsmen drifted. The middle class thinned. Work became something for someone else. The culture tilted. To labor was to confess you were not noble. To produce was to admit you needed cash. So people chased titles instead of trades. And then the crown made the worst trade of all. It traded independence for liquidity. It pledged tomorrow to survive today. By 1556, the empire's obligations were stacked like cordwood. Promises to pay soldiers. Promises to pay shipbuilders. Promises to pay bankers who had already counted their profit. In 1557, the math snapped. The king's agents faced creditors with empty hands. The ledger said the word no monarch wants to hear: insolvency. National bankruptcy is not a metaphor. It is a door slamming. It is a sudden silence where wages should be. It is cannon that cannot be loaded because the man who loads them went unpaid. They called it a suspension, a restructuring, a technical measure, but the street knew what it was. It was default dressed in perfume. Let that number sink in, even if you can't see it yet. Spain had more silver arriving than any power in living memory. Yet it could not meet its short-term payments. Because cash flow is a tyrant. You can be rich on paper and dead in practice. You can own the world and still miss payroll. The wars did not pause for accounting. Rebels did not accept IOUs. Enemies did not call a truce because Spain's balance sheet looked ugly. So Spain borrowed again. It rolled old debts into new ones. It paid yesterday with tomorrow. The monster stayed fed, and the monster grew. In 1575, the spiral tightened again. Another crisis, another bankruptcy, another lesson ignored. The crown treated default like a storm you wait out. Then came 1596, the third strike. 3 bankruptcies in one reign's long shadow. The rule of 3 written in red ink. The silver was plentiful. The credit was fragile. The patience of lenders was dying. Each time Spain defaulted, it paid a new price. Not only higher interest, not only harsher terms, it paid in reputation, the invisible currency of power. A kingdom's name is a bond. Once the bond cracks, every future promise costs more. Every loan becomes a negotiation with a loaded gun. Now watch the trap change shape. Because silver did something else. It freed the crown from needing its own people. When a ruler can fund himself with overseas treasure, he stops bargaining domestically. taxes become less important than shipments. Parliaments become furniture. Merchants become tools. The state grows heavy, centralized, and slow. That kind of government looks strong. It can order without asking. It can build without debate. But it is brittle because it forgets feedback. In England, rulers needed taxes and therefore needed consent. In Spain, the silver acted like a substitute for consent. The ledger gave the king autonomy, then quietly charged interest on that autonomy. The empire became a machine that ran on a single fuel, and single fuel machines fail spectacularly when supply dips, because supply always dips. Storms sink ships. Pirates steal cargo. Mines exhaust. Labor collapses. Even the earth has a balance sheet. Out in the high mountains, silver was not a miracle. It was a corpse factory. Men worked in thin air and toxic dust. Mercury turned hands into trembling instruments. The mountain paid its bill in lungs, but in Madrid, the money looked clean. Coins look innocent. That is their magic. They erased the suffering behind them. As the easy silver thinned, costs rose. Deeper shafts. More equipment. More dead. Lower quality ore. A slow tightening like a belt pulled one notch every year. The crown responded the way addicts respond. It did not reduce consumption. It demanded more supply. It squeezed colonies with higher taxes and harsher demands. You cannot tax blood into gold. You cannot force an economy to grow by whipping it. You can only force it to resent you. Now we arrive at the smoking gun moment. Not a battle, a document, a meeting, a set of terms that turned empire into collateral. In a dim room under the watch of clerks, creditors laid out conditions. They didn't speak of glory. They spoke of schedules, guarantees, and penalties. The negotiation was not diplomacy. It was foreclosure. Spain did not argue as a conqueror. It argued as a debtor trying to keep the keys. In paraphrase, the banker's message was brutal. Pay us first or the kingdom's war machine stops breathing. Pledge your future shipments or your present collapses. The crown agreed because it had to. The ledger forced it. The empire's sovereignty was being sliced and sold in installments. This is what liquidation looks like for a state. Not an auction of palaces, at least not immediately. An auction of future revenue streams. Imagine promising the next year's treasure before it even touched Spanish soil. That is not confidence. That is desperation with a crown on it. By the early 1600s, the illusion of endless silver started to fracture. The empire had built fixed costs on variable income. Armies, fleets, bureaucrats, pensions, churches. Fixed costs are unforgiving. They do not care if a ship arrives late. They do not care if a mine produces less. They demand payment on schedule. Then a real-world shock hit like a hammer. In 1628, a Dutch fleet captured a Spanish treasure convoy near Cuba. Suddenly, a year of expectations vanished at sea. In one stroke, the balance sheet lost its comfort blanket. The crown faced creditors with empty docks. The empire felt what it means to be dependent. You can survive a lost battle. You can survive a lost city. But losing cash flow is losing oxygen. It is financial suffocation. In Amsterdam, that captured treasure became fuel. Not for Spanish parades, for Dutch war effort, Dutch trade, Dutch expansion. Spain financed its enemy with its own metal. It was a theft, yes, but it was also a lesson. When your economy is hollow, your treasure becomes someone else's capital. The climax of this story is not a cannon blast. It is the moment the treasury chest opens and shows wood instead of coin. Defaults don't look cinematic at first. They look like unpaid soldiers, unrepaired ships, empty granaries, a sudden coldness in marketplaces. Hunger is the first messenger, then comes humiliation. Then comes loss of sovereignty, disguised as assistance from those who still have cash, because sovereignty is solvency. Say it slowly. Sovereignty is solvency. When you cannot pay, you must obey. People who once saluted now muttered. People who once cheered now counted crumbs. The empire's power turned into theater without funding. The court still wore velvet, but the countryside wore hunger. The gap widened. The nation became a stage where the richest props hid the poorest actors. Spain's armies became unreliable as wages delayed. Mutinies are accounting events with knives. A soldier without pay is a creditor with a sword. The empire's wars dragged on, but each year cost more and delivered less. Credit tightened like a noose. Interest rose like fever, and rivals learned to wait. They didn't need to smash Spain head on. They needed to let Spain bleed itself. The ledger was doing the work. As silver declined, Spain's trade position worsened. It had less to export besides raw treasure. It lacked competitive manufacturing. It lacked a productive middle. An economy without production is a body without muscle. It may have fat, it may have jewelry, but it cannot lift. So the empire entered the long descent. Not a collapse in a day, a slow surrender in decades. Territory trimmed away, influence evaporated, confidence decayed, and the scars lasted. Generations grew up inside a weaker Spain, living in the shadow of stories about a time when the world belonged to them. Debt also has an afterlife. Even after a default, obligations linger. Restructured payments, new loans, old bitterness. The ledger remembers longer than people do. Years turned into decades, decades into a century. Spain's finances became a chronic illness, managed, not cured. The empire's later leaders inherited the bill. The psychological damage was real. When a nation experiences repeated bankruptcy, it learns fear. It also learns denial. Both are dangerous teachers. Industries that never formed cannot be summoned overnight. Trust that was broken cannot be repaired with speeches. Wealth is built with boring work, not spectacular treasure. So how long did it take to pay it off? In this noir story, the final check is never a clean moment. The debt mutated across reigns, rolled into new obligations, and echoed into later centuries. By the time the empire truly stabilized its long financial wounds, the world had changed. Spain was no longer the center. It was a participant. The ledger had reassigned status. And that is the Spanish paradox. The richest empire in history died poor because it confused money with wealth. It stacked coins and neglected capacity. It fed war and starved industry. It believed the earth owed it prosperity. It believed silver was a substitute for farms, looms, and shipyards. The balance sheet punished that belief with mathematical cruelty. If you remember one image, remember this. Galleons arriving heavy with treasure, while ordinary people ration bread. That is what economic collapse looks like when it wears gold. So the next time you hear that empires fall because of invasions, pause. Look for the ledger. Look for the interest rate. Look for the debt schedule. Look for the cash flow. Armies are loud. Accountants are quiet. But the quiet men decide the ending. If you want to stay ahead of the people who still think history is decided by swords alone, subscribe to the channel, because the next empire doesn't fall on a battlefield. It falls on a balance sheet.